Good afternoon all. This session is about the disaster management, module 10. So, before we go into the details of disaster management, let's see what a disaster is. A disaster can be defined as any occurrence. Actually, this is the definition given by WHO. It can be defined as any occurrence that cause damage, ecological disruption, loss of human life, deterioration of health and health services on a scale sufficient to warrant an extraordinary response from outside the affected community or area. This is what is known as disaster. And now in today's scenario, we all are facing a disaster itself, that is a biological disaster. So hopefully you all are aware of what a disaster is. So disaster, and in this picture also depicts the different types of disaster, and it can be natural or man-made. The disasters can be man-made or it can be natural, and it causes, a simple example is, it causes ecological disruption, it causes severe numbers, it affects the number of human beings, animals as well. That is known as a disaster. And let's see one by one what a disaster management is. We'll discuss disaster management in the second half of the session, but first let's give a brief idea of what disaster management is. It is a continuous. So a disaster means it can be a flood. And the first picture, you are aware of the flood which we experienced 2 years back. That is flood we experienced in Kerala also, and such type of disaster. So management means a continuous and integrated process of planning and coordinating and implementing the measures. Let's see, in this picture a disaster has happened, that is flood. But we have to plan accordingly later on to prevent such type of disasters to happen again, and that's what's known as disaster management. A continuous and integrated process of planning, organizing, coordinating and implementing the measures which are necessary or expedient for prevention of nature, or we have to reduce the risk of any disaster which cause any serious consequences, capacity building or mitigation, then preparedness to deal with any disaster. So this is actually a disaster management cycle which include the preparedness, response, recovery and mitigation. We'll come to it each one by one in different steps. Disaster management means once if a disaster has happened, or if you are very much aware that a disaster will happen in the near time or near time, then we have to take some precautions. That's what's known as a disaster management cycle. So this disaster management cycle, the first, a disaster, and for in today's scenario you can take the biological disaster which is happening now, that is COVID-19. That is a disaster. So it was actually not, we were not expecting of such a disaster. It has happened due to many reasons. So preparedness, we have to prepare, like we have to give training to people, we have to be alert of how to handle that situation. Then if that happened, now the response is we are using mask. That's known as response. We are using mask, you are using hand sanitizers, etc. The recovery, those who are affected with this disease or this COVID-19 has to be given treatment or they have to go to quarantine, etc. Then mitigation, of course, how to reduce such type of disasters. Then, what are the different types of disaster? Disaster can be broadly divided into two types. One is natural disaster. Example, the calamities like earthquake, flood, cyclone, drought, famine, forest fire, dust storms, etc. are the natural disasters. And man-made disasters are actually the disasters which is caused due to the activity of human beings. That is due to a unscientific construction of a dam, due to the nuclear accidents, then hazardous waste accidents, oil spills, then that is this there's Chernobyl, then Bhopal gas tragedy. These are the man-made disasters. Because of the activity of human beings, many catastrophes has happened on nature. That's known as man-made disasters, and about the details of each disasters it was dealt in module 9. So here I'm not going to the details of that. Now, epidemic and pandemic. These are the two different terms which have to be aware of, and this comes under actually the biological disaster, but the biological disaster include epidemic and pandemic. What is actually the difference between these two? Epidemic means some disease which is happening. Epidemic means some disease which is happening in a particular localized area, but it spreads. The example of the epidemic which happened in Kerala is that of the Nipah virus. Nipah virus, that is in 2018. Most of the people were the victims of this disease. That is known as epidemic. Epidemic doesn't mean that what was the property of Nipah virus? Nipah virus was spread by this infection came first from the bats, that is T-Ropus. Then people got this by consuming the fruits which were eaten by these bats. But after once the man got the infection, that disease was spread from one person to another due to the close contact. But that Nipah virus was localized in an area around that north part of Kerala, that is Kozhikode or that area. It was localized, that infection or the epidemic spread only in that area. That means the disease spread is in a defined region. It's not widespread. So opposite of epidemic is pandemic. Pandemic means it don't have any geographical boundaries. The disease spread all over the world. Now in today's situation, we can't find a place which is not affected by this COVID-19 because it is spreading from one person to another in a very serious manner. The people who are living in forest are infected, people in island are infected, lot many people are affected with this COVID-19, and that's what's known as a pandemic. Pandemic means without geographical boundary the disease spread. It's like plague, Spanish flu, COVID-19, and actually this plague and all, it was man-made reasons. And that is what is known as a pandemic and an epidemic. Pandemic, no geographical boundary, the disease spreads. Epidemic in the localized area. But for controlling both the disease, the best practice is quarantine. Maybe that is the word which you frequently hear these days. That is quarantine. Those persons who are infected has to be isolated from others until that disease subsides. That's what's known as quarantine. That is the best practice. So let's see what the biological disasters are. The biological disasters are actually something which cause any disaster to a large scale of human beings or animals or plants, and that cause the death of the people. That's what's known as biological disaster. And this biological disaster can be natural, that is in the form of epidemics or pandemics. That's what I said. It can be like Nipah virus is spread from bats, but it will be in a localized area only. But if it is man-made like the bioterrorism and all, it causes serious problems to human beings. That is this disaster, that is the biological disaster meant for attacking or which is made to destruct or destroy the human race, that causes a serious problem. Like the examples are smallpox, anthrax, then typhus and plague, and these are the diseases which can be spread directly or it can be spread through some animals, and that's what's known as biological disaster. So we'll see what bioterrorism is. Bioterrorism is a common, that's an important term or a common term which comes under this biological disasters. What bioterrorism is? We know what terrorism is. So bioterrorism is actually attacking with the help of biological agents like small microorganisms like virus, bacteria or any other germs. very small organisms which is not visible to the naked eye is used in biological terrorism. One example is Japan, which used the plague, the disease plague was spread by Japanese in the year 1932 to 1945, which caused the death of so many number of people in China. And now one pandemic is going on. We are not aware of what the factor is. Is it man-made or is it spread from animals or anything? That has to be confirmed only. A few years will take. So the number of years will determine or will prove what is the reason behind the spread of these pandemic which is happening recently. So that is bioterrorism. Bioterrorism is attacking or spread or attacking people in a particular country with the help of a virus or bacteria or germs. That is known as bioterrorism. And there are different categories coming under this, and they are, and why biological, of course, why biological weapons are used, like why viruses and bacteria are used, because as you are aware, or maybe in a movie it was shown, like if a man kill another man, that one man will be sent to jail. If the one who is killing the other one will be sent to prison. But if an animal kills a man, nothing can be done with the animal. Of course, the brain behind the animal, if anybody like that can be accused, but that is very difficult. And not many cases we might have heard in the past 2 years about the snakes, about some animals and all. So why biological weapons? Very low cost. That is, the microbes will multiply enormously in the laboratory condition. We need only petri dishes and glasswares and the refrigerator to multiply these microorganisms. So low cost. Why countries go for bioterrorism? Low cost, because no gun, no army, no tank, no missiles, no rockets, nothing is needed. Only some wires, a small area, very small room with a culture medium like that is required. So low cost, then more efficient in terms of coverage. If you send a missile or something like that, you will be able to kill 50 people or 25 people like that only. But see, if you use these microorganisms, they will multiply enormously and it will be spread to thousands and millions of people. Then next, advances in biotechnology make the production very easy. That is what I said. You need only very little area, a refrigerator, and some petri dish or glasswares to make these multiply these microbes. Then have an unmatched destructive potential. The destructive potential of human beings or the target organisms is widespread. Then the lag time between the infection and appearance of symptoms is longer than the chemical response. See, that is important, because if you put a rocket, if you put a missile or something like that, by the time you put that area will be put in fire or many people will be dead. But when you use these biological agents, that person might have left open this microbe in a particular area on one day, but the infection will start spreading only after 1 month or 2 months. So nobody will realize by what time, from where this has started. And these are the main things why people go for bioterrorism, which is very, very dangerous. Then, legal biological agents can be produced easily and cheaply. That is, these microbes and this bacteria can be produced very cheaply in a culture medium in vials inside the laboratory conditions, and it's very difficult to detect. As I said, when many people are having some disease, in the first phase we'll say, like the pandemic which is spreading now, we'll say, well, yeah, many people are having cold or something like that. But the symptoms, if it is similar for 100 people or 50, 100 or 200, then only we will go to for investigation, like why this much number of people are having common cold, why this much number of people are facing this breathing disorders. Then only we will be able to detect. So the detection after the application is very late. That is why biological weapons are used by many countries. The different types of biological agents used there are three categories, that is A, B and C. Three categories are there. which are used in biological agents. First is category A. Category A is the agent which is of high priority that pose a threat to national security. Then, the biological agents which are used in category A are viruses, bacteria, toxins. That is the toxic substance which is produced from the body of this microbes. And then it causes high mortality. Then it is transmitted from one person to another in a very fast manner. That is known as category A. So category A, the disease spread is very fast and it requires special public preparedness or public health preparedness for among the people. It is the agents which are used are viruses, bacteria and toxins. Like Bacillus anthracis, then Clostridium botulinum, that is botulism, then this plague causing bacteria, that is Yersinia pestis. These are some of the agents which were used in the category which are coming under category A. The next is category B, and they are moderately easy to disseminate. Then the mortality is less when compared to the category. Mortality is less when compared to category A, and that is known as category B. And under category B, also the agents which are used are viruses, bacteria, toxins, and food waterborne pathogens come under category B. The viruses are alpha virus, that is chikungunya virus. Then bacteria, such as like the Burkitt malaria. Then toxins like Ricinus communis, then resin toxin, Clostridium, then food or waterborne pathogens these are some of the agents which come under category B. So the category B are moderately easy. It's not that easily spread from one person to another. And in this organism, it just the common example which you are aware maybe the chikungunya virus. It is spread with the help of some vector, or it will be spread through water like that. So only with the help of a vector agents these virus or microbes will be spread. So the disease spread will be moderately less compared to the category A1. The next is category C. Category C are the agents of the category C are the main agents of bioterrorism. Agents of bioterrorism mainly comes under this category C, and the ease of availability is more, and the ease of production and dissemination is very fast, and the mortality is very, very fast. And these are the reasons why these agents are, or these viruses or bacteria are used in bioterrorism under category C. That is, the examples of viruses which come under this are the Nipah virus, the hantavirus, the tick-borne hemorrhagic fever, etc. Then, so most of the countries have their own agencies and all to monitor the spread of any of these diseases. These are the category A, B, and C. So, whatever the biological disaster, the main problem which we face today is the main problem of the biological disaster is now we are facing, because it is caused by biological agents. The most important thing which can be done to escape or to keep away from these diseases is, of course, maintain good hygiene, like practices like washing hands or keeping distance from other person. These are the best practices. So always maintain hygiene to keep away from these microbes. That is the best practice which can be adopted to escape from this biological disasters. Then, let's see, what are the impacts of disasters? The impacts of disasters can be direct, indirect, or intangible effects. These three are the impacts of disasters. Direct. The direct impact are the the direct destruction of the physical structures. Like because of flood, if somebody loses his house or somebody loses his office place, or the destruction of lives, if lives are lost, these things come under the direct. So the impact of disasters are any disaster, man-made or natural, are first type is direct. Direct means destruction of physical structures like house, etc. House, destruction of loss of lives of man or animals or anything, your vehicles, any thing like that is known as direct loss, direct impact. Then next is indirect impact. Direct impact of disasters include the damage of the utility services, like if the revenue is lost or the cost which is associated with the cleaning up or waste disposal problems, etc. That is, if there is flood, for example, if in a place if there is flood, of course, in and around your house and everywhere there will be water, but that water you can't drink. That's what's known as indirect even. That is like loss of availability of water, the loss of availability of place for proper waste disposal. This one example is in case of flood, you cannot drink water, you cannot put waste anywhere, whatever, anything you put that will float. Everything is in water and you can't even take a drop of water from it. That's known as indirect. Then the third one is very, very important. That is intangible effect. Intangible effect means it's not visible. Intangible effect is the type of effect which all of me and you, all of you are facing this intangible effect. That's actually psychological or psychosocial. Well, in this pandemic, what is happening? You are not supposed to go out. That is, you have to stay home. That means that causes a lot of psychological disorders or depressions for people. If you have to sit in the same place all the time, that will lead to your emotions or feelings, like your psychological stability will be lost. That is the intangible effect. And maybe that is one of the most serious problems which most of you and me are facing nowadays. So these are the impacts of disaster. Direct means solid structures. Indirect means as a result of that you cannot do something else. And the third one is psychosocial problems. That is, during this disaster you cannot manage your situations properly, and that's known as intangible effects of disaster. And these are some of the other common impacts of this disaster. Disasters are one, loss of life. I said because of this disease you lose your life. Then livestock loss, because of flood many animals will die. Then loss of habitation, that is, if earthquake or flood comes, many people will lose their house. Then loss of livelihood, that means there will be no job. For example, nowadays, because of this pandemic which is happening now, that's because of COVID-19, many people have lost their jobs. Many are facing that threat. Many people have lost their jobs because of the lack of facilities, like because nobody is supposed to work anywhere because of social distancing, etc. Livelihood, most people lose their jobs. Then contamination of water sources. That is what I said. If this flood or something is happening, you cannot drink water from the water resources because of the threat of waterborne diseases. And now also, because we are hearing that many of the dead bodies are being put into the holy river, that is Ganga, because they don't have any, because of the loss of livelihood, they are not having money, and many people are now throwing the dead bodies in water. So as a result of that, also these viruses will spread through water bodies, right? And as well as along with that other microbes too. This is the contamination of water resource. Then, when any disaster happens, it can be maybe this maybe the natural or man-made. If it is any disaster like flood or earthquake or volcano or this plague or anything like that, The most affected people are the children. The seriously affected group of people are children. Children and ladies. Children and ladies are more susceptible to this disasters like flood and all. I'm not talking about this biological disaster. The group of people who are more susceptible to this disasters like flood or earthquake are the children and ladies because they cannot escape or run off from these situations. That's why they are most susceptible to these disasters. Then let's see what now we'll tell what disaster management is. So let's see what vulnerability is. Vulnerability is the circumstances which may lead. So you are vulnerable to certain situation. That's known as vulnerability. And in this picture it shows a big rock is on the top of a hill. Once if it rolls down and fall on person's head, we say it is a disaster or ദുരന്തം അല്ലേ? ദുരന്തമാകുന്നത് ആ പാറക്കല്ല് ഉരുണ്ട് ഒരാളുടെ തലയിലേക്ക് വീഴുമ്പോഴാണ് അതൊരു ദുരന്തം അല്ലെങ്കിൽ ഡിസാസ്റ്റർ ആകുന്നത്. But if a man is standing at the base of the hill and that rock is on the top of the hill, that's a hazard. ഒരു ആപത്താണ്. ഹസാർഡ് മീൻസ് ആപത്ത്. ആ പാറക്കല്ല് മുകളിൽ ഇരിക്കുന്നു, അതൊരു ആപത്താണ്. ആ പാറക്കല്ല് കുന്നിന്മേൽ ഇരിക്കുന്നത് ഇറ്റ് ഈസ് എ ഹസാർഡ്. ബട്ട് വൾണറബിലിറ്റി എന്ന് വെച്ചാൽ എന്താണ്? എ ചാൻസ് ഫോർ ദിസ് മാൻ ടു ബി ഹിറ്റ് ബൈ ദിസ് റോക്ക്. ആ പാറക്കല്ല് തറയിൽ വന്ന് വീഴാനുള്ളൊരു സാധ്യത, അതിനെയാണ് വൾണറബിലിറ്റി എന്ന് പറയുന്നത്. That is, so it describes the characteristic and circumstances of a community system or asset that make it susceptible to the damaging effects of a hazard. ഒരു ദുരന്തത്തിലേക്ക് എത്രത്തോളം ദുരന്തം ഉണ്ടാകാൻ സാധ്യതയുണ്ട്. That's what's known as vulnerability. And vulnerability may be of different factors. Can be physical, social, economic or some environmental factors. That is what vulnerability is. For example, tsunami. Vulnerability. Tsunami and vulnerability means those people who are living near the shore area are more prone to the disaster tsunami. See, tsunami is something which is coming from the oceans. So, you can say the people who are living near the beach areas or shore areas are more prone or more vulnerable to the disaster tsunami. This is known as vulnerability. Example is people living near the oceans are vulnerable to the attack of tsunami. That's known as vulnerability. So vulnerability are mainly of 4 types. There are 4 types of vulnerability. It can be, first one is physical vulnerability. This is what I said. One example, example which I showed now is also a physical vulnerability. Those buildings which are near the shore areas are vulnerable to the disaster caused by tsunami. That is what is known as physical vulnerability. That is the impact of physical impact. Means വീട് പൊട്ടി വീഴുക. That is what is known as physical impact or physiological environment. That is physical vulnerability. Next is economic vulnerability. Economic vulnerability means the population is more susceptible to this disaster because of, not because of the physical reasons of that area or that disaster, but because of the loss of assets, because of loss of business, etc. on these area, and that lead to poverty. For example, if the tsunami hit on a particular restaurant, that definitely will lead to the economic loss of that person who is doing business there. That is known as economic vulnerability. And social vulnerability. Social vulnerability means the inability of people or organizations to withstand the hazard. That is, if flood occurs at a particular area and the children or ladies will not be able to move out from the house to a safer place. That's known as social vulnerability because of fear or because of the less knowledge, etc. The people will remain in certain area. That is known as social vulnerability, or people who are who lose their house and all, they will not be able to construct it again. So they will be living in particular in some other place. That's what's known as social vulnerability. Then environmental vulnerability. Environmental vulnerability means if a disaster happened to a particular area, the resources at that area will be depleted. For example, you may remember because of the flood, we had a flood 3 years back, and after that flood, what happened? The topsoil was removed, and people said, Lord, many earthworms were dead. So this is actually known as the environmental vulnerability. Means the because of flood or soil erosion or because of these earthquakes, the soil conditions or the soil profile will be altered, and that will lead to the environmental imbalance, and so that area will be more vulnerable to these environmental factors. Now let's see what a risk is. So hope that picture clearly depicts that the rock on the top of a hill, that is a hazard. A person standing at the base of the hill is vulnerable to the hazard. Now, how much is the risk? That is the probability, that is known as risk. Then that is the probability that a community structure or geographical area is to be damaged or disrupted by the impact of a particular hazard is known as risk. So risk is actually a function of threat exploiting vulnerabilities to obtain damage or destroy assets. That is what is known as risk. And risk is a measure of the expected loss. How much the risk is. You can say the 20% risk. If a rock is kept on a hill, the risk for that man, he is vulnerable to that hazard at the rock. But how much? That is known as the risk. 20% chance for the rock to come down, 30% for the rock to come down, 40%, 50%, 100%. That is known as risk. Is actually a probability. The risk is the measure of the expected loss which is caused due to the hazard. Hope you remember the picture which I showed in the previous slides. That is, if a rock is over the hill, and this is actually the hazard, and the risk, how much percentage there is a chance for this rock to come down. That's what is known as risk. That is a measure of the losses or ഈ hazard അല്ലെങ്കിൽ ആപത്തിന്റെ ഒരു അളവ്. That is known as risk. So hazard into vulnerability. Hazard into vulnerability is equal to the disaster risk. Hazard multiplied. Hazard means a cyclone. Hazard into vulnerability cause the disaster risk. That is a relation or mathematical relationship between the hazard, vulnerability and risk. And this is important. Now let's see. Now let's see what resilience is. So resilience is actually the ability to bounce back. The ability to bounce back is known as resilience. Now, about this pandemic COVID-19, we are actually now in a status of resilience, going back to the normal condition. We hope that everything will be normal in the near future. Like what? We have adopted so many things like the using mask, social distancing, or maintaining good hygienic practices. Then we have started vaccination, etc. So that this is actually a resilience phase. In case of this flood also, you might have heard this word resilience. Resilience is actually recouping or going back to the normal stable condition is known as the resilience. Hoping for the best and what was the best we had. That is resilience. And resilience can be of two types. That is, resilience can be of two broad types. That is, hard resilience and soft resilience. Hard resilience means the physical structure of these structures which were lost because of this disaster is taken back. For example, after flood, what happened? Lot many buildings were lost, lot many schools were lost, part of schools or part of restaurants or offices, everything was lost. But after 6 months, what happened? We managed to reconstruct those buildings. That is known as hard resilience. The hard resilience building, that is at that area. So we understood why that buildings were lost because of flood. So the planning or the construction of the houses in that disaster prone area should be in a manner that it can withstand the disaster. വെള്ളപ്പൊക്കം കൊണ്ട് നഷ്ടപ്പെട്ട ഒരു സ്ഥലത്ത് വീണ്ടും വീട് വെക്കുമ്പോൾ ആ വെള്ളപ്പൊക്കത്തിനെ വിത്ത്സ്റ്റാൻഡ് ചെയ്യാൻ പറ്റുന്ന രീതിയിൽ modified construction has to be done. That's what's known as hard resilience. And next to soft resilience is the ability of the systems to absorb and recover from the impact of disasters without fundamental changes. And that is actually going hand in hand with the nature. That is actually a coordinated action of different government and non-government organizations, people together. Soft resilience means all of the government, non-government, the politicians, everyone has to work together to bring up together the people to withstand or to go ahead in a better manner. That is known as resilience. Going back to the good old days. That is known as resilience. So that is about resilience, vulnerability, hazard and risk. Now let's see what the disaster management cycle is. The disaster management cycle includes three phases, that is preparedness or preparation, response, then recovery and mitigation. So this is actually the disaster. You can see here this is shown here as the event. This event means it can be flood. This is the disaster. So events means the disaster. Disaster can be a flood. Disaster can be a fire or earthquake. Anything like that can be a disaster. So if you know that disaster is going to happen, these things can be done. So these things happen before a disaster. That is mitigation. Mitigation means you have to plan things accordingly. Capacity building. So for example, mitigation means if you are going to construct a house in a flood prone area, the construction of the house or piling works, or construction of the house, the basement of the house should be constructed in such a way that it should withstand the flood conditions. That is known as mitigation means actually planning. Capacity building. You have to plan things accordingly to withstand the disaster. And this can be done only if you know that a disaster is going to happen. I'm not talking about the biological disaster, I'm talking about the natural disaster. Mitigation. So this is actually planning or capacity building, like construction of house to withstand earthquake or construct, like in Japan or all these the earthquake prone areas, they will construct house with lightweight things. That is known as capacity building. Mitigation or planning. Then preparedness or preparation. Preparation means you have to prepare according to how to respond if flood happens. How you can withstand, like how to escape when flood comes. You have to prepare such a way, or you have to keep some, or in a two-story building, you have to keep your things in the second floor like that. You have to manage or plan things accordingly. That's what's known as preparedness or planning how to respond to a disaster. Then response. If that happened, these two, that is this mitigation and preparation, are actually before disaster. These two phases comes before disaster. Before disaster, you have to plan things. That is what is known as mitigation and preparedness. This can be done only if you know the disaster is going to happen, like cyclone or this flood or something. You should be aware that this is about to happen. We are giving information from this what the weather control or like that heavy rain will occur like that. So before, and this response and recovery, this part comes after the disaster. So the recovery and response comes after the disaster. That is restoration or reconstruction. Resilience is coming under this phase. Response and recovery. Recovery lana resilience okke varunathu. So after the disaster, what things has to be done to minimize the hazards of the disaster, and that is what is known as response and recovery. These four are the different parts of a disaster management cycle. So disaster management cycle, you can say before disaster and after disaster. And before disaster, the two phases can be mitigation and preparation, which include the planning phase. How to face the disaster, that is mitigation and preparation or preparedness. Then the next half, that is the response and recovery after disaster. What all things has to be done to go back to the original condition. That is what is recovery and response. And this is example, a few examples of each term. One, mitigation. I said mitigation include planning. Mitigation is planning phase. So for example, a place, when you construct a building or a house or an office in a place which is prone to earthquake, the construction of that building should be in such a manner that it can withstand the tremors or the forces which is exerted by these earthquakes. That is mitigation. And two is preparedness. For example, if any disaster is going to happen, like a flood or anything like that, certain training can be given to. This is actually only one example. Lot many things. This disaster management cycle, the phases will vary according to the disaster. So here, if any fire is happening, the first aid things which can be done, that is training can be given to the local people also to face the disaster. That is what is known as preparedness. Then response. So this is what I said, mitigation and preparedness. These two are before disaster. Preparedness and mitigation are two planning phases, and this happens before the disaster. This two happens before the disaster, and these two, the response and recovery, happens after the disaster. That is after the disaster response. So what all things can be done, like that people can be given the medical ailments, they can be given food or water or shelter like that. Then recovery means you are again taking back. The building materials are arranged in such a manner the parts which can be reused can be used. That is what is known as recovery. So these are the four phases of disaster management, and with this I conclude the session, and this module is also over. That is disaster management. Thank you.